Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. Today we got some breaking news regarding UFC 284 in Perth, Australia. And unfortunately, it's terrible news. One of the best fights on the card, a middleweight fight between Robert Whittaker and Paulo Costa, is now off. But we're going to talk about it in this video. Was it ever really on? We're going to talk about UFC contracts. We're going to talk about Robert Whittaker put out a video reacting to the news, whether or not he's going to stay on the card of UFC 284, who could be some potential opponents for Robert Whittaker. And we're going to talk about, could Paulo Costa end up cut by the UFC? Because I think that's a real possibility in the very near future. But there's a lot going on with this situation. First off, the news broke. ESPN is reporting that Paulo Costa is off. He is not fighting at UFC 284. He's off the card. And Robert Whittaker is now left without an opponent. And right now, it's basically being reported that Robert Whittaker is off the card, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in the video. I think it's a bit strange to say that already. But if you've been following Paulo Costa since this fight news has been announced, he has tweeted out multiple times. He has posted on Instagram multiple times that he has not signed a deal to fight Robert Whittaker at UFC 284. And Costa has had some contract negotiations issues with the UFC for a while now. He's on the last fight of his deal, and that's why this whole situation is going down the way it is. As far as we know, Paulo Costa is not injured, and this is super unfortunate. My initial reaction to this, I was really annoyed because, you know, I get it. Paulo Costa's having his issues with the UFC. Apparently never signed the bout agreement, which we're going to talk about here in a second. But this is the second time that Robert Whittaker versus Paulo Costa has been canceled. They were supposed to fight in April of 2021. Unfortunately, Costa pulled out for mysterious reasons then as well. I think Kelvin Gastelum ended up stepping in. Then his next fight was supposed to happen in August against Jared Cannonier. Costa kind of pulled out with mysterious reasons then as well. Kelvin Gastelum steps in again and fights Jared Cannonier on this time. And, you know, he had a fight, you know, against Marvin Vettori, and then he most recently fought Luke Rockhold at UFC 278 in August of this year. And now, I was really looking forward to seeing Costa versus Robert Whittaker. Second time it's booked, and it's just not happening. It was a really fun fight. Paulo Costa, say what you will about him, he is a very fun fighter to watch. And Robert Whittaker, elite of the elite in the middleweight division. You know, he's a guy that a lot of people look on as one of the best middleweight fighters in the UFC. And a lot of people think he's a shoo-in to beat the champion, Alex Pereira. Obviously, he already has 2 losses to Israel Adesanya, but Israel Adesanya is no longer the middleweight champion. So it was going to be very interesting because if Alex Pereira can hold on to the title against Israel Adesanya in the rematch, which is going to happen in 2023, this was potential a #1 contender fight. Depending on how it played out, you know, Paulo Costa has a loss to Israel Adesanya. Robert Whittaker has 2 losses to Israel Adesanya. If Pereira could keep the belt, then the winner of that fight was probably going to fight for the belt next. And even for Costa, he's only fought Izzy once. So if Izzy won and Costa went out there and let's say he destroyed Robert Whittaker, which, you know, that's a big task. But if he were to go out there and let's say stop Robert Whittaker in the first round, we could have seen Israel Adesanya versus Paulo Costa too. So this was a massive fight in the middleweight division. You know, it was Robert Whittaker fighting in Australia, in Perth, Australia, on the same card that we're going to get Islam Makhachev versus Alexander Volkanovski. And it's just bumming news that it's not happening. But I had a feeling since this was announced that it probably wasn't going to happen. I had my fingers crossed. I hope it would. But ever since this fight was announced, Paulo Costa has said, I haven't signed any deal. I've not signed a bout agreement. I'm not fighting Robert Whittaker in Perth, Australia. I'm negotiating with the UFC, is essentially what he said. And, you know, what happens with the UFC, and I've talked about this plenty of times with the Nate Diaz situation, when the UFC has a fighter that they want to keep under contract, they do not like to let them fight out their deals. And Paulo Costa is on the last fight of his deal. And the UFC has tried to re-sign him. They haven't been able to come to terms. So they were going to do the Paulo Costa-Robert Whittaker fight and I guess figure out the contract afterwards. But Paulo Costa's not happy with his current contract. And a lot of times what happens is they sign these contracts 6-7 fight deals. And I think Costa signed like a 6 or 7 fight deal. And if I remember correctly, he's making like 60 and 60, 60 to show, 60 to win, or 70 and 70, something along those lines. He's not happy with that. And a lot of fighters renegotiate their contracts before they even get to their last fight on the deal, and the UFC likes to do it particularly with guys that they want to keep within the UFC. And the UFC and Costa haven't been able to come to terms. Well, what happened is, I don't think Paulo Costa ever signed to fight Robert Whittaker. That's what he said. That's what I'm going to tend to believe. I know, Costa isn't the most reliable source, but he said since day one, since this fight has been announced, he's tweeted out multiple times, I have not signed any bout agreement. And what I think has been going on is, and the UFC tends to do this quite a bit, I've talked about it plenty of times in the past, when the UFC is trying to pressure a fighter to sign a bout agreement, what they'll do is they'll announce it to the fans. They'll say, just for example, for this fight, big middleweight fight added to UFC 284, Perth, Australia, Robert Whittaker versus Paulo Costa. Featured fight on the card, because I think there's 2 title fights on that card. Featured fight on the card. #1 contender fight, 2 of the top middleweights. And what happens is the fans, the media all run with that. And essentially it puts pressure on the fighter to then go ahead and sign that bout agreement. There's been times, I want to say, and don't quote me on this because I can't 100% remember, but there's been times, I think Israel Adesanya, Marvin Vettori too, where they announce a fight and the bout agreement isn't even signed. I think Israel Adesanya said like a month out, he still hadn't signed to fight Marvin Vettori. I think that was back at UFC 263, but I might be misremembering that. But there's been times where the UFC does this. They announce the fight. Then they either come to terms with the fighter based off the pressure that it puts on that fighter, because everyone gets excited for the fight. Everyone starts talking about it. And basically they're backed into a corner and they have to then fight anyway or sign to fight that fight, even though they don't necessarily want to for the deal they currently have. Or they're basically kind of forced into a corner to accept a new deal that they're not necessarily happy with. And I've seen a lot of people, and I've kind of talked about it a little bit myself, and I'm going to talk about it in this video as well. I've seen a lot of people shitting on Paulo Costa for this and say, Paulo Costa's constantly pulling out. Paulo Costa is scared of Robert Whittaker. And I don't think by any means Paulo Costa is scared of Robert Whittaker. We can have a debate whether Paulo Costa is worth what he thinks he's worth. And we'll talk about that in a minute here as well. But he's not scared to fight Robert Whittaker. He just wants a new deal that he deems fair. And there's been issues for the past year with Paulo Costa in the UFC trying to sign a new deal. And he never signed to fight this contract. I don't believe he signed this bout agreement to fight Robert Whittaker. So the UFC just announced it to put pressure on him to fight Robert Whittaker in Perth, Australia. And so now, if you look at what's happening, this is exactly what Dana White wants. This is exactly what the UFC wants. The fans are lashing out at Paulo Costa and saying, Paulo Costa doesn't want to fight anyone. And, Dana White will probably come out and say, Robert Whittaker, Paulo Costa doesn't want to fight Robert Whittaker. He just doesn't want to fight him, We tried everything we could. He turned down the fight. Essentially, that's what he's going to say and imply that Paulo Costa is scared. We've seen it time and time again. He's done it with GSP. He's done it with John Jones. He's done it with Francis Ngannou. He's done it time and time again where he says things that are far, very stretched from the truth. And I'm super disappointed this match isn't happening. But at the same time, I just wish the UFC figured out a way to just pay Paulo Costa and get this Robert Whittaker versus Paulo Costa fight made. And you have Robert Whittaker. We'll talk about the Robert Whittaker video. Robert Whittaker put out a video. And, I don't know why. He said certain things in this video that I thought were a little bit off. He said basically the UFC offered him a new deal. He wouldn't fight me no matter what. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit. You can find the video on his Twitter. I'll link it down in the description if you want to check it out. But basically, he's doing the UFC's bidding here. He's saying, you know what? Paulo Costa doesn't want to fight me. I'm disappointed. I'm not going to be on the Perth, Australia card, which is bizarre. UFC 284 is more than 7 weeks away. It's roughly 8 weeks. It was 8 weeks from last Saturday. And he's off the card. He's saying he's off the card now. And he's basically saying they offered him a new deal. He still didn't want it. Well, that doesn't mean they offered him a deal that's satisfactory to him. Okay. And I don't know the numbers. I don't know all the behind the scenes things. But the UFC is notorious for not wanting to pay guys. And, again, I don't know the numbers. And maybe Paulo Costa thinks he's worth more than he actually is. Again, we don't know the numbers, so it's hard to say. I do think there is a weird correlation in some of these guys, their heads kind of blow up. And I think a lot of fans talk about this too much too, where I think Paulo Costa, he's this fun character online. And a lot of people, like his tweets and his memes that he tweets out and his Instagram posts, and they think he's funny. And now Paulo Costa thinks he's some massive star. And I don't believe that's true. But I do believe there has to be some middle ground. Paulo Costa is an elite level middleweight. Paulo Costa is an exciting fighter to watch. I feel like there has to be a middle ground. Even if Costa, his head is blown up because he thinks he's funny online, he thinks he's funny on Twitter, has all these fans. And I think, even if that's the case, I think the UFC has to be able to find some middle ground where they're paying him more than 60 and 60 or 70 and 70 to fight. I think there has to be some way they can compromise and make this fight happen. But as far as whether or not I think it could still happen, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think Robert Whittaker and Paulo Costa is going to somehow miraculously be saved. And to be honest, to be devil's advocate for Paulo Costa, because I've said, I think the UFC has to find a way to make this happen and compromise. There's a chance that Costa ends up outside of the UFC. Because if you look at his resume, he doesn't have quality wins, really. I mean, his best win currently is Yoel Romero. That's back in, 2019, August of 2019, over 3 years ago. That is insanity. That is straight up insanity. Yoel Romero is not even with the organization anymore. And then his last fight, Luke Rockhold, returning after years of being off. Both of the guys looked absolutely atrocious in that fight. Then he's already lost to Israel Adesanya, got brutally outclassed. He lost to Marvin Vettori. He's had these weight cut issues, particularly in the Marvin Vettori fight, where he just shows up, says, well, we're fighting at 205. I think the UFC knew there was an injury going on there. But essentially, he's had these issues. He doesn't have this elite level resume. He's probably not going to fight. I guess he could fight Israel Adesanya in a rematch if he were to beat Robert Whittaker. But the UFC would spin it and say, well, he's already lost to the champion. He's never going to be champion in this organization. We want the guys that are looking to become champion. We want the ruthless killers. And I could really see Paulo Costa's not this massive star that he thinks he is. And I could really see a situation where the UFC gives him the worst possible fight, the worst possible matchup for the last fight on his deal, and then saying goodbye to him. Or they may just get straight up fed up with him and just cut him from the organization. Because I think Costa is thinking, I want to go get some of that YouTube boxing money. Well, you know what, Costa? I think you're going to be in for a surprise because those YouTube boxers are not going to want to box you. It's just not going to happen. Costa would destroy a lot of those guys in the YouTube boxing world. And I think he thinks, I'm going to go over there and make millions when you're not the type of fighter they're looking for. You're not 55 years old. You're not on a 25-fight losing streak and lost them all by KO, and you're not a wrestler. So you're not going to fit in over in that YouTube boxing world. So there is a chance, and I wouldn't be super happy about this, but I wouldn't be surprised that Paulo Costa ends up outside of the UFC, and the UFC could end up cutting Paulo Costa. Maybe he fights his last fight. Maybe he doesn't. I could truly see that happening. And Dana White and the UFC would just spin it. Oh, he's never going to be a champion. Look how terrible he looked against Luke Rockhold. Dana White would just put it out to all the Dana White simps, and they would all eat it up. And it's super unfortunate. I wish they would find a way to make this fight happen. I think it's unfortunate Robert Whittaker's like, well, they did everything they could. They offered him a new deal. He still didn't want to fight me. We don't know the numbers. Robert Whittaker doesn't know the numbers. And, who knows what kind of deal they could be offering. It could be a shit deal that he did not want, that he's forced to turn down. And then the UFC is going to say, we did everything. They're going to throw their hands up in the air and say, we've done everything we could. The kid just doesn't want to fight. That's what Dana White will say. And as far as Robert Whittaker staying on UFC 284 Perth, Australia, it has been said by Robert Whittaker, it's being reported by ESPN, that basically he's off the card. And I find that completely bizarre because Perth, Australia, UFC 284, which is Islam Makhachev, Alexander Volkanovski super fight, was 8 weeks from Saturday. It's Monday now. So it's just over 7 weeks away. They have thrown entire fight cards together in less time. UFC 279. They threw that entire fight card together in less than 3 weeks. You're telling me you can't find another opponent for Robert Whittaker so he can fight in Perth, Australia, in his home country of Australia? You're telling me he can't? You can't find somebody for him to fight? And I get it. Maybe the UFC doesn't want to pay him to fight somebody or he's just going to destroy him. But there's some legitimate options. And I have a couple options for you before I end this video. Why doesn't the UFC book Robert Whittaker versus Sean Strickland at UFC 284? Sean Strickland's number 7. I know the rankings might update. I know Sean Strickland just lost to Jarrett Cannonier, but it was a close fight. Could have went either way. Sean Strickland didn't take a lot of damage. Jared Cannonier's already fought Robert Whittaker. So just to keep Robert Whittaker fighting on the Perth card, why not do Whittaker versus Strickland? And then Strickland kind of gets rewarded, even though he technically lost the fight. He's been complaining the judges were bad. Why not throw him in there? I'm not saying that's as compelling as the Paulo Costa fight, but it'd be better than just taking Robert Whittaker off the card entirely. You could also throw together Robert Whittaker versus Dricus du Plessis. He just won, versus Darren Till. Darren Till fought Robert Whittaker back in 2020. Du Plessis looking for a big fight. He's looking to stay active. He didn't take a whole lot of damage in the Darren Till fight. He took some damage, but it's not like, it was a crazy amount of damage. It's not like he was crazy cut up. He would still have roughly 2 months to get prepared for the Robert Whittaker fight. And why not throw that together? Why not try to keep Robert Whittaker on the card? I get it. Those are really the only options because Adesanya's fighting Pereira. Jared Cannonier just fought Strickland. And who wants to see Robert Whittaker versus Jared Cannonier too? I for sure don't. Derek Brunson, we've already seen that. Roman Dolidze just announced he's fighting Marvin Vettori in March at UFC 286. Jack Hermanson just got destroyed by Roman Dolidze. We already talked about Dricus. Andre Muniz has a fight coming up, just announced. Nasruddin Imavov has a fight coming up against Kelvin Gastelum. Chris Curtis would probably take that fight, but at that point, you're having the number 14 guy fight the number 2 guy. I mean, to keep Whittaker on the card, I guess it would be fun, And Curtis is coming off a big win, but he fought an unranked guy in Joaquin Buckley. So I really don't think that makes a whole lot of sense. I think you either do Strickland or you do Dricus du Plessis. You either throw them in against Robert Whittaker, keep the fight intact, keep Robert Whittaker on UFC 284. But, overall, no matter what, both of those options are very disappointing in comparison to Robert Whittaker versus Paulo Costa. So it's just super disappointing. But, who knows what's liable to happen? Who knows if Paulo Costa ever fights in the UFC again? Who knows what the UFC is going to try to spin this and say Costa's scared of Whittaker? Again, I don't think that's the truth. I think what happened is the UFC announced this fight. Robert Whittaker signed his bout agreement. Paulo Costa did not. They were hoping the fans, the media, would put that pressure on Paulo Costa to eventually just cave and sign his new deal or sign the bout agreement for his last fight on his contract, fight Robert Whittaker, and that be the end of it, and UFC would still get a great middleweight fight. But shout out to Paulo Costa. He's not caving. Regardless if I think he's right or wrong, he's trying to stand up to the UFC. And Nate Diaz stood up to the UFC. They tried to feed him to Khamzat Chimaev, and then look what ended up happening at UFC 279. Chimaev misses weight. There's that whole debacle. Nate Diaz leaves on a win. So who knows what's bound to happen. Glover Teixeira didn't want to fight Magomed Ankalaev, and now he's fighting for a title in January against Jamal Hill. So crazier things have happened. There's a slight chance, I would say less than 5% chance, somehow they figure it out and book Robert Whittaker versus Paulo Costa on that Perth card still. Somehow it comes back together. I don't think it's super likely. But let me know what you guys think about all this down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.